All right, hello everyone. It's Patrick with a brand new video for the 5750 class. We're heading into the vocabulary instruction modules, and I didn't really like what I had from past classes as far as just being clear and just succinct, I would say. So I'm making something new. I brought in my professional videographer, Alan Trent, so he's getting a little extra credit for the class right now, doing a little video service for me, and we're here in Laramie in my office. And I'm going to give you a little overview of the vocabulary instruction side. I'm not going to really sort of demonstrate some of those classroom practices that we've used, because I do have a number of classroom videos from some of the research studies we've done the last couple years. So I'm planning to use a couple clips so you can really see whether it's me or one of our teachers in action with kids doing some of the things that you'll read about or I may mention briefly. So this is really just my chance to sort of give an overview for these couple weeks on vocabulary development and instruction. Now you're reading Michael Graves' vocabulary book, and he's a good friend. He is incredibly knowledgeable, and probably it will do everything that I would want to do now much better. So I'm going to try not to sort of overdo it today, and so that everything you read in Michael's sort of introductory chapters is basically just a repetition of what I'm saying. I have, of course, most of you know, been working actively in this area of vocabulary instruction for a decade at least, working with teachers, projects from just very local collaborations with individual teacher to, the multi-million-dollar federal grant-funded project that Jim Bauman and I did a few years back. So this is a passion, and I want, again, just not sort of give you everything that Michael would give you, but sort of orient you in the ways that I have come to see the whole issues around vocabulary development and instruction. So I'm going to start with just the nature of vocabulary, okay? And I actually have a handout that I'm going to post that you can download that goes along with this little video, so I didn't take the time to kind of make all of my bullets here. But, we started with this the very first week. There's nothing, vocabulary is the quintessential unconstrained skill or knowledge domain, right? You and I, with advanced college degrees, are still learning vocabulary. It never goes away. It would still be a significant obstacle to me with a PhD if I went over to a microbiology classroom and tried to be a student there. What I would really get hung up on as I read the texts or listened to the lectures would be the vocabulary, because I don't have it in that domain. So we never stop learning it, and it never stops being sort of a critical element and a real obstacle to kind of academic performance. All right, so the nature of English vocabulary, I'm sure like all languages, is very pronounced. There is a very small percentage of high-frequency words that we see and use all the time, and then there's an almost endless number of extremely low-frequency words. I mean, we're talking 170,000 of them, right? Many of which only appear in every 1 million written words. Yet when they do, they may be just the word that a kid needs to know to comprehend the text that they're reading. Of course, that makes things very challenging. How do you get kids to learn the meanings of words that, they may see once in every couple million words? But again, when they do appear, are exactly what they need to know. And that gives us a little sense of kind of how ambiguous and challenging this task is. Next, I'm going to use Stephen Stahl's wonderful phrase, which is, books are where the words are. There's been a nice analysis of the percentage of lower frequency words in a variety of oral and written contexts. And there is no question that books contain by far the highest frequency of unfamiliar, of low frequency words. Even children's picture books written for primary age students contain more low frequency words than oral conversation between college educated adults. So books are where the words are, and thus, unsurprisingly, vocabulary instruction, in just about every level is going to focus around sort of book reading, read aloud, reading texts, and the words that come up within that context. All right. Vocabulary as an unconstrained skill, our growth, our vocabulary growth is, to use a word I really like to use in this case, incremental. It's not the letters of the alphabet where you just decide to get it done and you sit down for, those months of kindergarten and, you teach most of your kids most of those letters. It's not the times tables where second grade, third grade, whatever it is, you just say, these are my 2 months, I'm dedicating it to the times tables and kids are going to know it when they're done. I mean, vocabulary develops very slowly over time. You cannot, I always say, take the absolute best, most exceptional vocabulary teacher, in our country today. Let's say she's at 3rd grade. What she does at that 1 grade is a drop in the bucket in terms of vocabulary knowledge for what kids will need by the time they hit 7th grade, and then 10th grade, and then 12th grade, and then university setting. You can't do it in 1 year. If any sort of element of instruction deserves, consistent, articulated, school-wide effort across the grades, it's vocabulary. And it's because of that incremental nature of growth and that sort of unconstrained sort of body out there that there is to learn. All right. We ought to throw out that, we talk all the time about whether kids know the word or don't know the word. That is a gross oversimplification. I mean, have you ever stopped to think, what does it mean to know a word? Clearly, there is levels of knowing a word. Anywhere from what Valman and I used to like to call sort of getting your foot in the door. You've heard that word, and maybe in the right context, you could sort of figure out or infer the meaning of it, to, a high degree of expressive mastery, where you can use that word, properly and skillfully in oral speech or in written language. And there's gradations between those ends. And so that ought to figure into, how we're conceiving of our vocabulary instruction and what sort of level of word knowledge we're aiming for and why. Finally, a really interesting question and very relevant one for instruction is there a sequence to vocabulary, to word learning? Should or must kids learn some words before they learn other words? Andy B. Miller, who's a well-known scholar in literacy and in this area of vocabulary instruction, he was a consultant on one of my grant projects, likes to say yes. Because he has found, he'll point out that kids learn walk before they learn stride, before they learn amble. So, and he's done some really hard work to demonstrate that that's true. Well, on the other side, experts like Beck and McCowan tend to say no. That may be true sans instruction in sort of natural development context. But what if you decide as a 1st grade teacher to teach your kids amble? and do it sort of skillfully and kind of make it that word meaning concrete. Is there anything that necessarily prevents them to learning YAML because they don't know stride? Probably not. And so, what is the effect of instruction in terms of this developmental sequence? And, I just throw that out there as it's part of what makes vocabulary instruction very difficult and why schools have probably done, historically a pretty poor job in it, is there's no clear sense of scope and sequence. There's no clear sense of curriculum. Which words to teach when. There's a lot of activity around that right now and probably some good projects and some helpful information coming our way, but in the end, it's probably subjective, someone's best idea about how those things work, because that ambiguous nature of vocabulary as an unconstrained skill. Okay, let's move on to sort of understanding the urgency. Now that those are some of the important pieces that are kind of foundational for my understanding of what this beast that is vocabulary is. I talk about this all the time with schools and teachers. I'm going to be real succinct, and of course you'll read some of this in Mike's book as well. First of all, we know that there is an enormous vocabulary gap that exists upon entrance to kindergarten between let's say, the upper quartile and the bottom quartile in terms of vocabulary knowledge for our children who are entering school. You see sort of 4,000 word gap bandied around. Some people will say 6,000 words. That's probably a good rough estimate, a 4,000 to 6,000 word gap between what the top quartile, the haves in vocabulary knowledge, the words that they know, to the bottom quartile, the have-nots in terms of vocabulary knowledge. I mean, of course, that all traces back to sort of early language socialization and interaction patterns in families and parental sort of vocabulary knowledge levels. And, unsurprisingly, it really maps pretty closely to socioeconomic status. Some people don't like that perspective, but I just say you have to deal with the facts, because it's pretty straightforward in study after study. And it's where you all live, I'm sure. That kids from low-income families, from families that sort of are mired in poverty, a lot of the structural realities of living in poverty that makes sort of the kinds of family interactions and parent-child interactions that we, as middle-class folk kind of take for granted, make it very difficult, which is not saying anything about sort of the quality of those parents. There are just realities that come with living in poverty that, many of us probably have never experienced, but that really impact this. Of course, another point is, again, the sort of vocabulary level of parents who are those primary sort of interaction partners through those preschool years. Regardless, huge gap upon entrance to school. So we'd like to think optimistically that historically school has sort of helped to ameliorate or to eliminate that gap. That would be wrong. We know historically that schools have really not affected that vocabulary gap. And it might be a little optimistic even to say that they've put kids, from the different quartiles on sort of parallel growth paths such that the rich don't get richer and the poor get poorer. Because that certainly appears in some of the studies and estimates in terms of long-term vocabulary growth. So this is a thorny issue, and it's one that historically schools have not been able to solve. We know, that there's a real consequence to this vocabulary knowledge gap. Vocabulary knowledge is highly predictive of reading comprehension. We've seen sort of vocabulary knowledge on entrance to kindergarten uses a pretty accurate predictor of middle school reading comprehension. Vocabulary knowledge in first grade is a pretty accurate sort of predictor of high school reading comprehension. I read studies all the time. I think I've said this on the discussion boards where it's amazing. Like you know, folks have assessed students at certain grade, 3rd grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, and you know, that you find that, oh, these English learners, their vocabulary knowledge is in the 19th percentile. Lo and behold, their reading comprehension is at the 20th percentile. I mean, the number of times that literally those two scores are within 1 percentile point is phenomenal. I mean, that's really noticing nothing new. Jeannie Shaw said decades ago that if you want a good quick measure of reading comprehension, just give kids a vocabulary test, you know, and that probably will, you know, help you sort of predict pretty well where they're at in terms of reading comprehension. All right, so, you know, this stuff is super important. I think you all know that. We all know that now. Kind of post National Reading Panel, Common Core Standards. We found that you know, we know it's the #1 ingredient in text reading difficulty. All the various formulas that try and establish text reading difficulty, the #1 sort of active agent in just about all of them is the percentage of sort of low frequency words that appear in the text. It's vocabulary knowledge. That's what makes text hard to read, by and large, for kids. I mentioned Jeannie Shaw. I'll throw in, you know, we've probably talked about it before, at least, you know, those who've been in other classes, the classic 4th grade slump. You've probably heard the term. It came from Shaw and Snow back at Harvard University, saying, okay, we have this clear data, and we've had it forever, that shows that socioeconomic status is this powerful sort of driver of long-term student achievement. But why? What are the actual sort of concrete mechanisms that cause that relationship to be true? And so they sent in a team of scholars led by Jeannie into the schools to assess kids, you know, low-income kids, sort of middle-class kids coming up through the school years, elementary years. They sent a team of scholars into the homes of these kids to document in qualitative fashion what was going on there, to try and get down to the sort of, again, those concrete agents that tend to lead towards that disproportionate rate of school failure of low SES kids. And lo and behold, by about 3rd and definitely in 4th grade, they found that the low-income kids, that vocabulary and the text that they were required to read was outpacing their vocabulary knowledge. And even if they had good fluent reading skills, they were no longer able to sort of successfully navigate those texts. That vocabulary is maybe not the only, you know, variable, but it was probably the most salient active agent in terms of those difficulties that low-income kids face, especially as they hit those upper elementary years. So, you know, that's the urgency of the task. Let's move on. I'm going to give you just a few perspectives on instruction in kind of this overview sense and try and move this along quickly. First, I've already said, just based on the nature of vocabulary knowledge itself, there is nothing that deserves that consistent school-wide effort more than vocabulary instruction. And if it's not happening, it needs to be. There's nothing that an individual teacher at an individual grade level can really do to transform, you know, to close that vocabulary gap, to transform a kid. You know, all of a sudden they're leaping from a bottom quartile up to the norm or above. It's just not going to happen in 1 year. That's just not the nature of it. Okay? You know, what we know from sort of what are largely considered successful interventions in teaching individual word meanings, and I don't want to sort of, we'll talk about this later, say that that's the, you know, sum total of vocabulary instruction, but when we look at research interventions for teaching individual word meanings, we see that the successful projects, kids largely learn about 3 words a day. So about 12, 15 words a week. stretch that over the course of the year, 450, 500 words a year through specific instruction. Now they're learning more words than that each and every year, trust me, but as far as driven by specific instruction in those word meanings. So 400 or 500 words, remember that gap was about 4,000 to 5,000 in kindergarten? Clearly we need to do more than just teach those individual words. Now, unfortunately, I think this was sort of misinterpreted back in, when I started in this business, the 80s, 90s, and there's kind of a movement away from we can never teach enough words that kids need to learn, so let's just really make sure that they learn words through wide reading and so forth. And so I think schools adopted kind of a laissez-faire attitude towards vocabulary, and that's a gross sort of misunderstanding of what those numbers mean. Yeah, if the gap's 5,000 and we're only teaching 500, but if they're the right 500, that can mean a whole lot. And that's sort of going to be our burden, is teaching the right words in the right ways. Okay, so if kids are learning a lot more words than we're teaching them, where is that coming from? Well, obviously they're inferring words through lots of context in their everyday life, and certainly through their reading. What we know about sort of learning words in the context of reading is that optimistically it happens about 5% of the time. When we encounter unknown words in reading, kids successfully infer about one meaning out of 20. Some people have gone a little lower than that. So, you kind of go, geez, what happened to those other 19, right? But that's just the nature of text and context. It's typically not as directive as we tend to think about it. Now, does that mean that's unimportant? Not at all. If you read enough and you encounter enough of those words. I made the point about one summer, I think it was before my son started 5th grade, I sort of roughly estimated the number of words he read in the summer. It was 1.2 million words. Okay, so let's say just a small percentage of those, 1%, 2% were unfamiliar to him. Well, 1% of 1.2 million is still quite a bit of words. 10,000 unfamiliar words that he came across. Some such thing. Forgive me, I may have got my math wrong. And even if he learns 1 out of 20 of those, sort of probably it's 1,000 words, 1 out of 20 of those, he still added 50 new words to his vocabulary. Just from his own wide reading. That's not too shabby when we're talking about maybe being able to teach 500 during the year. Contrast that, can you picture an incoming 5th grader who read 100 words over the summer? We probably all could. So they encountered maybe 5 unfamiliar words and they learned 1 out of, and you see sort of how the rich can get richer, and also this driving role of wide reading in vocabulary development. Not just the explicit instruction, but, effective wide reading. Connie Jewell's study that we referred to in terms of things like decoding proficiency in 1st grade and how, predictive that was of effective reading at the end of 4th grade. Well, lo and behold, they also took vocabulary measures in that study, and when they compared the kids who were, struggling readers at the end of 1st grade with those who were proficient, there was a wide gap in terms of vocabulary knowledge at the end of 4th grade. I mean, these are kids that are in the same classrooms receiving the same vocabulary instruction or lack thereof. But, proficient readers, the rich get richer and the poor got poor because they're not doing that wide reading that makes even that 1 word learned out of 20 something that, really adds up. All right, in terms of instruction, this is common sensual, but more is better. The more repetition, the more intensity that we teach a given word meaning, the better a student learns. But the more intensity I provide, and that word means the less time there is to teach those. There's an interesting dynamic at play here where it's crystal clear from research that, again, sort of more interactions, more repetition, more ongoing review around target words leads to better word learning. But it also, there's an opportunity cost to that more, which means that we're teaching less words. And when we have a very substantial gap, quantity is important. So I like to push a balanced perspective that says quality and quantity is important. We have a set of words that we teach, I call them target words with a fairly high degree of intensity, that we expect sort of mastery, and we do that because we really believe that they're high value words that will really benefit the kids going forward. Simultaneously, we try and sort of collect and flood and so forth, bring the quantity dimension. It's sort of less quality of instruction in other areas. And so I think good comprehensive vocabulary instruction will always find ways to balance that sort of high quality instruction that we know leads to greater mastery with the sort of briefer, less intensive, but sort of broader net kind of exposure to words that also produces word learning. So, for instance, we know in a repeated reading situation in primary grades, without any explicit instruction in unfamiliar vocabulary words, kids learned about 1 out of 10 unfamiliar words, just by hearing a text read repeatedly. So that's that sort of inference thing going on, but not in sort of your own reading, but in a read aloud setting that's repeated. If the teacher just provided brief explanations around those words, just in singleton fashion, that sort of word learning rose to about 20%. So you learn double the amount of words. Brief explanations plus some degree of ongoing review, and we're not talking about sort of enormous ongoing review, and that percentage rose to about 40%. So, again, this idea that we're going to teach some high-value target words with, a fair degree of intensity and ongoing review, hopefully to bump that sort of word learning, that mastery up. Maybe we're hitting 80%, 90%. Nobody ever learns all the words that you try and teach them. I know that now from a decade of vocabulary research. I wish they would, but they won't. So, but we're going to try and take that as high as possible with that small pool of words. But, again, 2 words out of 10, 20%, with just brief explanations can really add up if we provide a lot of brief explanation. And if we can do even a strategic, brief, efficient, ongoing review, then that goes up to 4 out of 10. Now we're sort of really starting to hit the quantity side of things. Okay, sort of a couple more points here. First, not all words are equal when it comes to instruction. I always use two clear sort of stereotypical words. The word sandspit. It comes up in The Island of the Blue Dolphins. Most of you know that classic in children's literature. And it's actually rather important because it's the setting for, where Karana lives and these activities that she's doing. So sandspit. Of course, very concrete, very visual. I want kids to know it. Wyoming kids, okay, maybe need to explain that. So what do? Pull a Google image of a sand sticking out into the sea, and I put it up on the board, and I go, kids, notice it says Karana's, built her hut on the sandspit. You know what a sandspit is? It's right there. Done. No more. 20 years later, they'll probably still know what sandspit is. It's concrete. It's highly visual. How about democracy? Teach those same 4th graders democracy. Yeah, good luck, right? Highly conceptual, abstract term that, you can picture yourself doing all these sorts of, knowledge, semantic maps and, charts, and just to try and give 4th graders some small handle on the concept of democracy. And so we really need to, not all words are created equal, as Mike Graves has written a book called, and so the instruction sort of needs to take into account. When can we, sans fit, done, moving on. When do we have to really bring all of our tools to the table? Because it is very important to learn that science concept of adaptation, or that social studies concept of government, or, you think about, that's a little bit of the problem of, say, something like Beck and McCowan's well-known tier distinction of words. Tier 3, content area words. Yeah, okay, but I'm teaching American history to my 5th graders, and I've got musket versus taxation without representation. Yeah, I guess they're both tier 3, but those are totally different in terms of musket. It looks like this, kids. Old gun. Taxation. Again, we're getting into our semantic maps and our clusters and really investing in that instruction. So, that's going to really impact the way we think about teaching words. Finally, I'll leave you with this, which is that, what we're going to be looking at over these 2 units is multifaceted or comprehensive vocabulary instruction. Around the schoolhouse, we typically tend to think of teaching those key target words, often from our core programs, as vocabulary instruction. And sure, that has a real role to play. But, here's my formula I've come down to. You'll read Mike's, and it's what we tested in the McVitt project. I've moved on a little bit from that. And, I like teachers to think about target word instruction, those high-value keywords, maybe 12 a week, 10, 12, 13 words a week. I like them to think about sort of word collecting. That's the quantity side. That's the term I'm using right now. Word floods. We collect words in social studies, and that legend unit, and the read aloud text, and, in all those ways, to go for sort of that rich flood of words, to get the quantity element. I'm using the phrase, and you'll see some of our work with teaching for application, teaching vocabulary for application. Now we're talking about a very small set of words that are critical, that we're talking about a high intensity of instruction where we want kids not just to know the meanings, but literally be able to use those words in sort of analyzing literary texts and writing responses to them and so forth. So think about our general academic vocabulary and character trait words and connectives. I mean, people are ooh and ah over our 5th grade writing project because the kids sound so smart because we taught them to use although, even though, however. In contrast, the Southern slave owners were, and people see that and they go, whoa, those kids are great. We taught a small set of terms for application, and the kids learned to apply them. Now, when I say that, teachers always say, oh yeah, that's what I want. That's what I want. Because, and naturally, the problem is, if you're teaching for application, we're talking about a small number of words over a long period of time. And then again, oops, that gap's 6,000 words. We've got, so these things happen simultaneously. And finally, the last piece is sort of teaching word learning strategies. There's no question that over time, again, kids need to and they will learn far more words than we can ever teach them explicitly. So why not give them the best tools possible to do just that? And so these are typically our sort of morphemic analysis, using knowledge of prefixes and roots and affixes to infer word meanings, and sort of using context cues to infer word meanings in the context of reading. And probably in the best case scenario, putting those two together. There's still limits to what kids are going to infer from context, but I don't think we've hit them, even with our most sort of skilled readers. So, if they can do better, they should. And that will really contribute in the long haul to this vocabulary learning. Now, the last thing I'll leave with in terms of instruction is there's this notion that I think is very useful, very, helpful, of word consciousness. And what that means is sort of this general interest in, an enthusiasm for, an awareness of words and language in, sort of the classroom environment and beyond. And so there's a lot of talk these days about sort of teaching word consciousness, which, is certainly a great idea and going in the right direction. Honestly, what I feel like I've sort of observed over 10 years of doing this in classrooms is that if you do the first 4 things, word consciousness is sort of the logical outcome. When we take vocabulary instruction seriously in the classroom, teach it with intensity, kids inevitably sort of develop that interest in and that awareness of words. And so I kind of have come to leave it out of my sort of model of comprehensive vocabulary instruction. Not because I think it's unimportant, it may be the most critical of all of this, but because I think that if you do the other things in terms of explicit teaching, that it's inevitable that you generate this sort of word-conscious classroom, and I think that's what I've seen. Okay, I'm going to stop there. It's probably far longer than I have money to pay Alan for making this video, and we'll come back to some of this for sort of the second module in vocabulary. Thanks, and we'll see you on the discussion boards, everyone.